If you own a BMW, it's going to have leaks. And today I'm going to be showing you my processes for diagnosing any type of fluid leak on any of these cars. This is Project Hunter. It's a 2006 E83 X3 BMW with an M54 engine and an all-wheel drive package. Alright, since the engine is cold, let's start with the coolant leak. So the best way to start any leak diagnosis is to inspect the entire car. We did that on the very first episode on this X3. If you missed that, I'll put the link in the description for you. But we did find a couple drops of coolant directly below this area right here on the driver's side of the radiator. So this is where I believe the coolant leak is to be coming from. You can see a bit of coolant gathering up on that drain petcock there. Next thing I'm going to do is get access to our cooling system. In this case, on this car, it has an expansion tank here mounted to the radiator with a radiator cap. Next, we're going to bust out the cooling system pressure tester. Now this is necessary for diagnosing coolant leaks. You have to put pressure into the system to figure out where it's coming from. We have BMW adapters in here. This is for this style BMW tank. So we're going to get our adapters installed and we're going to pressurize it. Put the link for any of this stuff in the description. Next step is to install our adapter. Now I prefer this hand pump style. Some people like the pneumatic ones where you use compressed air to charge the system. However, I feel like I just have a bit more control with these ones and you never have to run the risk of potentially overpressurizing the system. I'm at about 10 psi right now. We can check to see if the leak has started to come back again. If not, you can bump it up to 15, 16 psi and see if that gets the leak to go. So I bumped it up to about 18 psi. I wouldn't go any higher than that. And looking with a quality flashlight, I was able to see some fluid building up in that seam a bit more. So I know that the leak's coming from there. I'm just going to sit on it and observe it for a little while longer so I can get a good confirmed diagnosis. You can also take some brake cleaner and spray it up there and evaporate all that coolant and get a good check on it that way, or take compressed air with a needle or a wand and just blow all that coolant out and see if it returns. So I did exactly that. I hit it with some brake cleaner, sprayed it off with some compressed air, and this thing's really starting to leak now with 18 psi in it. And you can see it's steadily dripping off of that drain plug, so I know that the leak is coming from directly above, and we're going to have to rectify that first as opposed to just throwing a whole cooling system at this thing, because you could recommend the hose, the bracket, the thermostat assembly, the expansion tank, but we'll start with what's obvious for now and then see if we need to replace anything in the future. So now we can relieve the pressure out of our cooling system. Now with the cooling system diagnosed, the next step is to figure out where all of this engine oil is coming from. I mean, it's on the transmission lines over here, the oil level sensor, the bottom of the oil pan. I thought we were going to be looking at a rear main, but luckily I haven't seen too much oil inside of the bell housing, so I'm feeling a lot better about that. And the interesting thing is that usually this lower side of the oil pan, the passenger side, leaks first. But in this case, all of our engine oil is really gathered up on the driver's side. So in order for us to diagnose this, we're going to need to get the engine warm and then pressure wash and clean all of this stuff off. But if we're going to get the engine warm, then we might as well check the transmission level, because these transmissions have to be heated up to between 30 to 50 degrees Celsius. So I think the next step is to get the car fired up, get it up to temperature, check the fluid level through this plug right here, and then we'll take it outside while it's warm and we will pressure wash and get all of this garbage off the underside. And also, the reason why we are checking the trans level is because there's so much fluid back here. It's possible that it could be a transmission leak as well, and the car hasn't been shifting perfectly, so we want to see what the transmission fluid level is at before we go any further. Now, I picked up some replacement fluid just to top it off in case it needs it, but in order to figure out that this needed Dextron 6, you need to check the sticker on the bottom of your transmission to get the part number for the fluid and to figure out what type of transmission you have in your car. Next step is I'm going to connect into ISTA so I can see transmission temperatures while the engine is running. So in ISTA, I was able to pull up my control unit list. I found EGS, the transmission control. We're going to go to call up ECU functions. Now we can go into diagnosis scan, transmission functions, transmission oil temperature, read state. We're at 24 degrees Celsius. We need 30 to 50. And then I'll do it one more time. Just shift from park to reverse to neutral, to drive, go up into the Steptronics, go from gear 1, 1, 2, 3, gear 2, 1, 2, 3, gear 3. Now we can go back to park and let it warm up. Okay, our transmission fluid is up to 30 degrees Celsius. Now we can begin the fill and fluid level check. And the transmission is low. And now we can cap it. I soaked my jacket with transmission fluid, but that's the way it goes. Those drain plugs are a pain in the ass. Okay, now we can turn her off. I'm gonna leave the key on. So now that the transmission's topped up, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into component triggering here, and I'm going to delete the adaptations out of the transmission. Adaptation values were reset. Okay, so we are good there. And now what we can do is we can drive the car. So far we've diagnosed the coolant leak in the engine bay. We checked the transmission fluid level. It was about a half quart low. We also reset the transmission adaptation values. Next thing is we're going to get this thing pulled outside, spray off all that engine oil, and then we can drive it and see if the transmission has improved. Now before I take this thing off jack stands, it looks like that we've had a couple more fresh drops, and they are directly below the oil level sensors. So I'm hoping that it's just that gasket on the sensor that's leaking pretty severely. We're still going to bring this thing outside and pressure wash it, and then we'll recheck it after. So I'm going to do the bottom end first instead of the engine bay. That way I'm not crawling around in a bunch of swamp down here, and then I'll spray the engine bay off after that. But what I'm going to do is put floor jacks in the front and the rear and just lift this whole side of the vehicle up so I can get good access underneath. And I chalked the wheels on the other side. Last step, engine bay. Let's take her for a drive, see how the transmission shifts. She also needs some fuel. My allergies are killing me today. Fingers crossed. Still didn't feel perfect. Better. Up. So third gear around 5,000 RPM. It does slip up a little bit, but I think it's still plenty drivable. I think, yes, it may need a transmission in the future, but I think this transmission still has some life left in it. We could service it and see if that makes things better, but it's always a roll of the dice when you do a transmission service to fix an issue like this at higher mileage. It's not always a guaranteed solution. We just got a low coolant light. Good thing we're almost home. You know, city driving and everything else like that, the transmission performs fine. So as long as you're not beating on it and really putting it under load and revving it out up to 4.5, 5,000 RPM, I think this transmission would be just fine. I think it just can't really take abuse. And if it did, I think that'll just shorten the lifespan on it. But all in all, I feel like this transmission's got at least 50K left in it, you know, as long as you drive it nice. A service might help prolong that, but also a transmission service may make it worse. So let's see if we can get eyes on this oil leak. This is wild, guys. This thing is just hemorrhaging oil. I had this all cleaned up perfectly, and just within that drive, it completely saturated the trans pan, blew all the way back to the transfer case, and that oil level sensor is totally saturated. So I'm going to hit this with some brake cleaner real quick and then just monitor it inside the shop with the engine running. Maybe this brake cleaner will fix my allergies. Now I'm going to hold the engine RPMs up to like 2,000 or 3,000 for a little bit and see if I can get that oil leak to start showing itself. I think it needs higher RPM. I'm going to take it up to the gas station, put some fuel in it because the light's on, and then I will come back and recheck. So I took it to the gas station, got the RPMs up a little bit. You can see some oil starting to collect, but you can see this trail that's going up towards the front drive shaft. And then that trail continues to go up and around above that front drive shaft towards the dipstick tube. I still haven't confirmed it yet, but I think it's coming up from that side of the engine and then dripping down over here. So based off this oil sign right here and this oil sign right here, I think it's coming up from this driver's side of the block and then dripping down and saturating this oil level sensor. My initial thought is that it's coming from the dipstick tube up above the front drive shaft, but I'm gonna have to do a little bit more testing to see if we can confirm that. So I'm still testing, but it looks like the oil level sensor is starting to push some oil out. So that's definitely one of our issues. You can see this seam right here. It's starting to bubble up. You can see it percolating. So that's definitely one of our issues, is a bad oil level sensor. This Diag kicked my ass, guys, I'm not gonna lie, but I think I found the issue, so let me show you. So the oil level sensor is leaking at the plastic seam, so we definitely need to replace that. There's no doubt about that. Now for this other leak, there's oil coming down the pan here, and there's oil coming down the pan back here. The only thing that's above there is the dipstick tube. Now the dipstick tube comes down and attaches to the engine mount bracket with that 13mm bolt, and then it goes into the side of the oil pan. So I drove the car and I got it up to about 5,000 RPM on the highway, and I pulled over at the gas station with my flashlight and in my inspection mirror, and I checked this dipstick tube O-ring, and it definitely had some oil in it when I stopped. Now I cleaned this off with brake cleaner before I left, and it was really clean. So I did catch oil on that thing at the gas station. I drove it home, and let me change camera. And if you follow that leak down, it goes behind this front drive shaft right here, and then it keeps tracing down here. So it's leaking out of that dipstick tube O-ring, coming down behind this front drive shaft, and it's leaking down the oil pan right up here, and then down towards the oil level sensor, and then it's pulling up. And then it's pulling up on the oil pan right here. So I'm gonna call this an oil level sensor and a dipstick tube O-ring, and that's where I'm gonna start. Well guys, that was not an easy oil leak diagnosis, and in my opinion, it's actually a pretty rare issue. I've never seen an oil dipstick tube like that spill its guts and want to leak so much oil so fast. I have seen oil level sensors like that fail along the plastic seam, but I've never seen an oil dipstick tube spew oil. But today was a success. We diagnosed the coolant leak, we diagnosed the oil leak, we checked the transmission fluid level, we reset adaptations, checked to see if that improved our symptoms at all, which honestly it really didn't. But I also don't think that we have a major leak at the transmission pan like I did before. We should probably service it in order to extend the life of that transmission, see if we can get like another 50K out of it. But we got a really good starting point, so now I have enough information to start getting a parts list dialed in, and then we can start work on this car. I'm also going to add an oil filter housing reseal on this. It's not the source of the leak. It could be because when those oil filter housings leak, they leak down the driver's side of the engine, sort of towards that dipstick tube. But this one's just seeping, and it has some evidence that it's been leaking in the past. So the rest of the car is dry. I figured we might as well take care of it, and then this thing will be buttoned up tight for oil leaks. So I think that's going to call it a wrap for the day. I got to get inside and get these allergies taken care of, but we did have a successful diagnosis on Project Hunter. We are in good shape to get an accurate parts list going ahead, and we're not going to be doing any guesswork, throwing parts of this thing and just hoping that it fixes it. Honestly, it's really good news. The rear main seal isn't leaking, the oil pan gasket isn't leaking, and those are two huge jobs. The oil pan on these all-wheel drive cars are like 10 plus hours. Removing the transmission on this car would be like a 10 plus hour job as well to get to the rear main. So honestly, I'm relieved because now I don't have to pull the transmission or drop the front subframe, which is great news for me and great news for Josh too. So I hope you guys enjoyed, or I hope you learned something new. And as always, folks, I will see you on my next day off. Cheers.